I always start these forums the same way. One of the things that we do here at the Murphy Institute, which I would like to welcome to you this morning, we are affiliated with the City University of New York School of Professional Studies. We run a variety of programs here, and that information is out and around. We're not going to go through it today. We got a big agenda. But this is New Labor Forum. For just about 3 decades, this has tracked a discussion in the labor movement and around it. It is also a journal of workers' culture and poetry and literature. We would ask everybody here who's from a union, if you're not taking an individual subscription and you're here this morning, I consider you a criminal. If you are a union leader and you have not supported this institutionally by getting subscriptions for your staff, your stewards, your delegates, I think it's wrong. This journal needs to be supported, and there's a lot of union leaders here today, and we would like your support for it. Thank you. This morning we are going to have a discussion on a subject that some of us in this room, like Bob Master, have been having for decades. It remains unresolved. It is the situation of organized labor, particularly the union sector, and the Democratic Party. We are about to enter into, and I know we always say this, probably the most important election that the unions have faced since the last one.
It was hard.
But this one is particularly important. Our numbers speak for itself. The trends in the economy lay out a difficult terrain under the best of circumstances. Resources allocated, decisions made in this next year and a half, 2 years, will lay the basis for a struggle for a decade. This morning we are joined by Basil Smerkle. He is a political professional and a policy analyst whose commentary is featured in local national media outlets, including the online publication The Hill. In April, he was appointed the executive director of the New York State Democratic Party by former Governor David Paterson. With a degree from Cornell University, Industrial Labor Relations, and a master's in public policy from the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia, he is presently an adjunct professor of labor studies at Columbia and here at the Murphy Institute. As a member of the community service organization 100 Black Men, he helped start the Eagle Academy in the Bronx. Our next panelist is no stranger to this audience or to the Murphy Institute. Juan Gonzalez has been a staff columnist with the New York Daily News since 1987 and co-hosts Democracy Now! He is a 2-time recipient of the George Polk Award for Commentary and the first reporter to consistently expose the health effects arising from September 11, 2001 attacks and the cover-up of these by government officials. He is founder and past president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, where he created a project to improve coverage of the Latino community and recruit and retain Latino journalists. A founding member of the Young Lords Party in the 1970s and of the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights in the 1980s, Gonzalez has received Life Achievement Awards from the Hispanic Heritage Federation, the National Council of La Raza, and the National Puerto Rican Coalition. Gonzalez has written 4 books. We always plug books, including, most recently, News for All the People, the epic story of race and the American media with Joseph Torres, and is a member of the editorial board of the New Labor Forum, which I spoke to you about. Yes. Randy Weingarten, an old friend, and is the president of the American Federation of Teachers, AFL-CIO, which represents teachers, paraprofessionals, and school-related personnel, higher education faculty and staff, nurses, and other healthcare professionals, local, state, and federal government employees, and early childhood educators. The AFT and a broad array of parent and community partners have collaborated on events across the country to advance a community and educator-driven agenda for public school reform. Prior to her election as the AFT president, she served for 12 years as president of the United Federation of Teachers, AFT Local 2, representing educators in the New York City public school system. We kind of know it as the UFT, as well as home child care providers and other workers in health, law, and education. While UFT president, Weingarten chaired New York City's Municipal Labor Committee, an umbrella organization for the city's 100-plus public sector schools, including those representing higher education and public service employees. Weingarten's column, What Matters Most, appears in the New York Times Sunday Review, the third Sunday of each month. Larry Cohn, who served as president of the Communication Workers of America, CWA, the 700,000-member union of telephone, airline, broadcast, journalism, and government workers, among others. During his 10-year tenure as president, he actively promoted internal union democracy and membership involvement and mobilized labor for causes that range from strong action on climate change to electoral reform. Before joining CWA in the 1970s, he helped organize Jobs with Justice, a labor community alliance that promotes solidarity, and in 2013 led CWA, along with the Sierra Club, Greenpeace, and the NAACP, in convening the Democracy Initiative to pursue structural political reforms. Cohn continues to chair the board and help build Democracy Initiative, which now is supported by more than 50 unions and progressive groups, and is actively involved in an initiative he founded called Making Progressive Politics Work. In terms of format today, we will do a round of questionings with the panel, and then we will ask people here to submit questions in writing. And some of you have come with questions, so get them in early. Fill them out on cards. You may put your institution and your name on here, and we may or may not use your question, but please submit them up. We'll try to use as many as we can. We're going to allow a lot of time for discussion. I would also like to acknowledge the presence of the director of the Murphy Institute, who's here today, Greg Mancios. What are the constituencies talking about, and what are they working forward to as we approach 2016? What's the discussion out there, Juan?
Well, I think anybody who's been paying attention to the beginnings of this presidential race realizes that generally speaking, the American people are dissatisfied with the existing state of politics in America. But unfortunately, it's from both ends of the spectrum. In the Republican Party, it's clear by the rise of Donald Trump and some of the other non-traditional candidates that the Republican electorate doesn't like the established candidates and is at least searching for someone who speaks to their needs and their concerns. And among Democrats, and you're seeing obviously the rise of support for Bernie Sanders, reflecting dissatisfaction among at least the active Democratic voters as to what their choices are. So there's basically, I believe, the big thing right now is that there's this dissatisfaction with the normal choices that voters get. The problem is, unfortunately, and I know this as a journalist who's been at this for a long time, it is amazing how much media we have in the United States and how little knowledge the American people have. It's almost an inverse relationship. So that the problem is being able to have debates on the substantive issues that are riling the American people, because essentially the country still hasn't recovered from the Great Recession. Most people still have not recovered from the Great Recession, and they're dissatisfied and angry about what has happened to them over the last really decades, but especially when the Great Recession represented such a loss of wealth and income for so many Americans that most people have not yet recovered. So I think that's the big thing right now, the general dissatisfaction with the existing choices, both in the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party.
All right, we're going to come back to that, I'm sure, as we go through this. The next question is to Basil. The labor movement's about to spend another several hundreds of millions of dollars in another election round. Probably going back to the 2007 period. Since then, some people estimate labor spent as much as almost $1 billion on all elections. what does the Democratic Party have to say to the organized labor that would indicate that that's a wise expenditure?
Well, we have to step up. There's no question about it. And Juan is absolutely right. There's tremendous dissatisfaction with government broadly, and certainly both political parties. And it's reflected in the candidates that are sort of bubbling up to the top and gaining a tremendous amount of traction. And let me throw out a few other things. In the last, I think, 2 presidential cycles, we've lost, Democrats, so when I say we, I mean Democrats. Democrats have lost almost 1,000 seats across the country. When you look at there was a story some months ago that a key demographic, particularly in the South, a lot of Democratic white males have been voting Republican over the last cycle. And state parties, so I'm the executive director of the New York State Democratic Party, but state parties across the country. I was in Minneapolis for the DNC meeting. We were a couple of weeks ago, and my peers, all 50 states, gathered to talk about how parties are going to be impacted in this election. And we're all actually struggling because even though, and I've said this many, many times, I love my president. I love my president. But the kind of campaign that he ran in 2008 and 2012, it changed the way campaigns are done. It radically changed campaigns. And it's been very, very difficult to get individuals, and it's not just young people, it's folks from across this generationally. It's become increasingly difficult to talk to them about the importance of supporting a party structure. And a lot of that is a result of the dissatisfaction in political institutions. But our argument, my argument, and why I think it's so important that we understand the influence, the support that organized labor has traditionally given to Democrats, and why we can't take that for granted, is because even though we spend a lot of time thinking about presidential campaigns, we need to spend so much more time thinking about, or as much time thinking about state races. And that is so incredibly important. And I think we have to work more closely with labor to get that information out there, get that, and be able to sort of support a lot of the folks that are running, whether it's dog catcher or city council member. They actually do have dog catchers elections. So, but everyone down ballot, those are extraordinarily important races. So I think we all have to acknowledge that and get that information out there.
Thank you. We're going to come back to that in different ways also. Randy, the AFT provided an early endorsement for Secretary Clinton. She's a senator from this state. We know her well. But what are the yardsticks, besides the candidate winning, that the AFT and labor in general is using to measure what is going to be success in this coming round? If you would like to talk to that.
Well, first, it's always great to be back in New York. But there's much too much money in politics. Citizens United is probably the worst decision. I mean, the voting rights shall be decision is pretty bad, but the Citizens United decision has fundamentally changed, even more than the way in which Barack Obama ran in 2008. It's fundamentally changed the nature of these national elections. And you see this in terms of just what's happened. This is over a year before the conventions, not even a year before the election. And we have wall-to-wall coverage of basically, yelling and screaming at each other, as opposed to what the issues are. And so people are really pissed off. It's not just pissed off with government in Washington. People are pissed off with institutions. There's virtually no trust in any institutions. And so the people who hate public education use that to undermine public education. The people who hate government use that to undermine government on both sides. And so the yardstick actually is, how do we create some ability to get something done after an election? We can actually mobilize a lot of people to be engaged in elections. You can mobilize on hate, you can mobilize on common ground, you can mobilize against, I bring two things with me almost every day in every plane ride I take. This from the Roosevelt Institute called Rewriting the Rules, which is really a blueprint about how to change the economy, and this, which is Scott Walker, who's actually tried to divide the working class. And I bring them with me because it is a reminder for me that it is not about an individual candidate. It is about how you get something done for American workers and working families. So, frankly, the down-ballot races, the gubernatorial races, the state legislative races, the city council races, and it's really who can bring on that day in November or that, that period of time, who can actually bring that wave, which is what we will need at that point in time. Last thing I'll say is, if you watch 2014, it's a different perspective now that I have now that I'm all around the country. In Florida, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania less so, but Florida, Wisconsin, Ohio, the dreck that was on TV, the undermining of candidates, the amount of money calling our candidates any name in the book just created more and more and more of this antipathy towards government being an entity to solve problems.
Thank you. So, Larry, you're working very hard for Bernie Sanders. And, there's an element of excitement around the Sanders campaign 9 months ago. You and I were right out here in the hallway talking about it didn't look like it was going to be a very competitive year. There were certain assumptions about it. It's turned into something else. What are your yardsticks for success in this effort?
So the number one yardstick to me is, are we building a mass movement for real change? So what I say as a surrogate and volunteer, I might add, for Bernie, is I paraphrase from the civil rights movement 50 years ago. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. Bernie says it as enough is enough, or no more business as usual. It's not working. And to be really blunt, a third term for this president, regardless of who the candidate is, who runs on that kind of notion, does not work. So there's three people here. I'm just going to ask them to stand up. Bianca Cunningham, Jerome Thompson, Clarence Adams, all fired, union-busting Cablevision and Verizon Wireless. Clarence's case will take years to go through the NLRB, even an NLRB that we helped put in. The best NLRB you could have as individuals. The system is fundamentally rotten, whether we're talking about voting rights or the corruption of billionaires taking over our political system. And for me to look, this is just from my union, just to avoid, to look them in the eye and say, what am I doing since I left? I have got to be in the streets with them as a volunteer, building a mass movement for democracy and economic justice. It's not working. So why did I volunteer for Bernie? And it's a little bit humorous. My term ended on June 8th. And thank you, guys.
But, before we end, will you tell all of us what we can do to help these workers?
Absolutely. Absolutely. My term ended on June 8th. June 10th, I went to see Bernie. I know him for 20 years. I said, Bernie, I don't think you're going to be the next president, but we need to build a mass movement. Your campaign is the way to do it. Now, I've since changed my mind, seeing the poll numbers and the way people have reacted. I said, I'm going to volunteer 10 hours a week. And, my joke is it's become 10 hours a day. And why? Because, what I've seen in Iowa 3 times, 3 trips there, recently Labor Day weekend, in South Carolina, in North Carolina, is an incredible effort to build this mass movement. And along the way, building incredible support for him in these states, where no longer is it just about building an independent movement for political change to get the money out of politics. Couldn't agree more with Randy. It's corrupted, it's polluted, voters in, money out, economic justice issues at the forefront. But now actually a chance to win these primaries and build this movement and elect somebody. I was an Obama delegate and an Obama supporter as a superdelegate 8 years ago. And at this time 8 years ago, nobody believed that this president had a chance. I think we're now in a similar situation, and it's up to all of us to stand up, fight back, and build this campaign.
Yes.
You know, it's already been mentioned that, you know, not every union member votes Democratic, but there's also that 90% of the working class that's not in the unions. And you know, what does organized labor have to say to that 90% of the working class that we don't have that intimate workplace contact with every day? And I'm going to ask all the panelists to kind of respond to that, and I'm going to start with one.
You know, well, I think to me, one of the most interesting things that's happened in the last several years in terms of organized labor is that the most powerful labor movement that's developed in years has not developed necessarily within the structures of organized labor, which is the Fight for 15, but rather organized labor, recognizing its limited organizational capacity, has reached out to the general working population and taken on the Fight for 15, some unions, as the way to raise labor consciousness in America. And I think it's had a big impact. And in fact, when we talk about what Larry says about building the movements, I believe that the movements for social change already exist in the country. The question is, will the political candidates become the full representative of those movements? There's 4 major mass movements in American society right now, I believe. One is the Black Lives Matter movement. 2 is the Dreamers movement around immigration reform led by the young people. 3 is the fight of many millions of young Americans and others around climate change. And 4th is the Fight for 15. Those are all existing, powerful mass movements that have thousands and thousands of people already active in them. The problem is that they're all like single-issue movements. And you need, for a political movement, you've got to have a multi-issue approach. And to my mind, there's still a question to what degree Bernie Sanders, for instance, can represent or speak to the Dreamers and the Black Lives Matter movement. There's lots of questions in terms of how Hillary Clinton can address some of these movements. And so what you have is, the question is, will the movements come together behind a candidate and propel that candidate, or will the candidates try to co-opt the movements? So who's going to utilize who in the process of this next presidential race?
Yeah, I mean, both candidates have had their awkward moments with Black Lives Matter, and there are some significant differences in terms of approach on some of the climate, environmental issues. And the Dreamers, you know, this goes back to something that somebody said before about the importance of state and local elections. You know, particularly for the Dreamers movement, so much of that can be dealt with at the state level in terms of creating a better climate, more fairness. But as we go through this, how important are these other movements to the unions and to their strategic thinking going forward? What's the plan here?
Randy, so we spend a lot of, so I would actually add 2 others. One of which is very locally based, because education is locally based, but one is emerging as well, which is, and this one is focused in Chicago, but in Pittsburgh and other places, which is to fix, not close, failing schools. And we have a hunger strike going on in Chicago right now for over a month around Dyett High School in terms of creating, a neighborhood community high school. And the second one I would add is that the notion that college must be affordable. And that is something that is, but it's not, it doesn't have the same kind of, a lot of these things are more locally based, and a lot of them are, as opposed to what SEIU and others have done in terms of the Fight for 15, they have not captured the same kind of national attention, but they are as intense. So what we've tried to do nationally, Eddie, is that there's 2 strategies. Barbara Bowen, who is on our executive council, has really been championing one, which is membership engagement. And we now have, I tease about 2 really important resolutions were passed in July. The member engagement resolution is actually more important than the endorsement resolution. And so we are actually starting to talk with every single one of our members. Double the number of activists, triple the number of people who are engaged. Because what we've seen throughout the country is then when we not only do direct action, but we find common ground, particularly with communities, and make communities our new density, and when members are really involved, that's when we win. And instead of us taking over other movements, it is how are we respectful and work with other movements. So we work with Black Lives Matter, and Black Lives Matter will be at our Human Rights Conference. We help the dreamers and work with the dreamers. We do the kinds of things to help with climate change. But this is a matter of how movements act together, or we as the labor movement, as we as the teachers union or the nurses union, since we are now the second largest nurses union, how do we act as respectful partners, not trying to take over, but to end up creating an infrastructure so that we actually move an agenda for working people.
Go ahead, Larry.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that, actually. And to bring it back to this campaign, I mean, I think, again, for me, one of the reasons that I did volunteer was that there's the opportunity for people to build their own campaign. And what Bernie says is we need a political revolution in this country. And I think it's nothing short of a political revolution. It's just not working with the billionaires, whether it's the Koch brothers or the ones who fund any super PAC. The super PACs are not working. They need to go. We need to get much more fundamental about the kind of change we need. And I think, whether it's Waterloo, Iowa, or, here in New York City, many examples of a political movement in these cities across the country that we have to get behind. And the presidential candidates, and I do believe we're doing that, are here to help spin off all those campaigns, not to control them. Whether it's a political campaign for the city council in Waterloo, or municipal funding in Chicago, or whether it's a campaign for free higher education. This used to be this CUNY free higher education. Why can't it be free again? And we need to spin off those campaigns. Medicare for all. This election shouldn't be an end. That these candidates should be supporting those kinds of mass movements against the TPP, for fair trade, a different kind of global economy. And I think those things, Juan, do come into a common narrative that we can embrace when we talk about economic justice, democracy, and climate change.
Thank you. So let's take this to the Democratic Party for a minute. There are these mass movements, some of which are not really interested in electoral politics in a traditional sense, but the Democratic Party has been kind of an ideological big tent, running right of center, somewhere left of center, everything in between. How's the Democratic Party looking at this kind of new surge of ideas and ideologies, frankly? What's the plan?
Well, that's a big question. Well, it's interesting. I was having a conversation about something related the other day, and I think not everyone in Black Lives Matter, for example, is necessarily going to get involved in, go work at a government agency or necessarily get involved in a political campaign. They might. But, there are a number of opportunities for the Democratic Party to engage any or all of these movements. We just have to really go ahead and be the big tent that we say we are. But I'll also sort of transition to a little bit of the conversation about bringing organized labor into this. My mother was a school teacher for 30 years. She taught special ed in the New York City public school system, and God bless her. She just retired.
Yay.
Right? But it was her talking about her job, the union. When she came home, that got me interested and engaged in organized labor, which got me to Cornell at the Labor Relations School. But I wonder how much that is replicated in households today, that sort of parent to child and the engagement in labor and that conversation. There's a lot of folks that I teach, some here, but also where I teach at Columbia, they don't have a union member in their immediate household. So trying to talk to them about the value of organized labor becomes a slightly more difficult conversation, and then talking to them about the connection of labor to political parties and electoral politics becomes an even more difficult conversation. But I go back to the fundamentals of, I think, why that relationship should exist. And if you explain, for example, that between the 1940s and 60s or 70s here in New York City, organized labor was responsible for 50,000 units of housing. I mean, that's huge, especially when you're talking about gentrification now in the city of New York and how important that was. But as we talk about, I think, putting some of these, or these movements sort of connecting to each other and to organized labor, I go back to the pocketbook issues. That's what drives so many people to the polls. And I'll just give you one very quick statistic. It was reported that African American and white households, the median African American household, the median white household has $143,000 in assets. The median black household, $11,000. And when you see, it's not just income disparity, it's wealth disparity. And if we can have a broader conversation, I think Democrats need to be a part of it as well, have a broad conversation of how Black Lives Matter, the college affordability movement, how we talk about not just increasing the minimum wage, which is extremely important, but also wealth creation.
Exactly.
to try to bridge that divide and inequality. There, I think you'll bring so many more people to the table.
Yeah, I'm also going to ask people to, if you have questions on the cards, hold them up. Our staff will get them and bring them forward. You know, one of the, I think, problems that we've had over the years, and I remember a conversation years ago with Ed Cleary, the state AFL-CIO president, at the New York Times, where, you know, we pointed out to the Times that the unions actually view themselves as the effective anti-poverty movement. And it goes to this question of wealth building. You know, if you talk to your average building trades person, they understand this mechanism to build and acquire family wealth, ownership, et cetera, how important that was, and created certain barriers to protect their own interests. But right now, the political structure for the last 40 years has been in a disempowering workers at the workplace, crushing wages in the private sector, and basically, and you know, Larry, I know you've experienced this firsthand, we've watched jobs just be completely destroyed, which had the effect of isolating the public sector workers and allows a Scott Walker to try to come out and demagogically destroy standards for what's left of what we like to call the middle class standard. How do we, as organized labor, begin to turn that around? And how culpable is the Democratic Party in this thing? I'll start with Larry and then Randy, and then others can comment.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, the Democratic Party per se is not the root of this problem, but the root of this problem lies in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It lies in the wealthiest families in this country. Enough is never enough for them. They always have new standards of their power. And I do think, I mean, to be a little edgier, that the Democratic Party doesn't step up to where the edge of that is in the movements that we just talked about. It doesn't step up to where the incredible anger is among even CWAers who have a decent standard of living. It doesn't step up to the Verizons or the Cablevisions all too often. But I think in New York City, we will step up, and that's what we can do, is send a clear message that not only are these firings out of line, but the whole way that Verizon can operate in New York City is out of line. And when are we going to hold them accountable, not just as Democrats, but as the citizens in New York? Cablevision is worse. And, you know, again, I could chew up all the minutes just on those companies, let alone every other company in every other industry. And I think the problem is when we supported this president 8 years ago, Employee Free Choice Act was on that agenda. I actually questioned him in Iowa about that. He said, I'll put on my shoes, and he never put his shoes on. He didn't put his shoes on in Madison, Wisconsin. I begged him, personally begged him, and Vice President Biden to go there. They didn't go. And, you know, Bernie, last 2 weeks ago, and this is not just about Bernie, but with no prodding, goes to Ingredion in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, with his shoes on, pickets with workers there who got taken over by a global corporation. And sadly, the first presidential candidate since 1968, Bobby Kennedy, to walk a picket line during a presidential campaign. I do say to Democrats, as a DNC member, enough's enough here too. Which side are you on? We can't just settle for what's already here. It's not working.
Look, I agree with Larry. And we've both been in those meetings with the president and the vice president, where we have fought that fight, and we've been pretty sharp privately about these things. But I think it's bigger than that, because I think it's, that a candidate, whether it's Hillary or whether it's Bernie, whoever the standard bearer is for the Democratic Party, the candidate is one thing. The movement is another. Mm-hmm. We believed when Barack Obama was elected, there was a savior complex around the country, that he was going to be the next Messiah. And he was going to, with his magic wand, be able to do everything. Now, there were things that I actually wish that he did that he didn't do on education, on other kinds of things, on EFCA and things like that. By the way, both Bernie and Hillary were the first endorsers in terms of EFCA when we introduced employee free choice a long time ago. But the bottom line is, it goes back to the issue about movements and what we can take for our own power. We have to force the Democratic Party to be the party of the working class again, of the middle class again. What has happened is that the Democratic Party has, because of Citizens United, every candidate spends more time dialing for dollars than actually doing the work that they need to do, connecting to people. And that's why, and Larry actually was one of the first people who said this, but the intersection between of democracy and economy is the biggest problem we have. And the issue is, and this is, I think, where we diverge, the issue is, how do we fix it? And how do we actually, not how do we make the big speech, because we need the activists, but actually how do we also make sure that we get it fixed? And so the reason I think that people went after the labor movement, both the private sector and the public sector, deindustrialization killed the private sector labor movement. Deindustrialization. That's why I keep on going back to this. Because why is Germany different than us? Germany has a vibrant labor movement, has a vibrant industry. We can argue about whether some of that industry is wrong or right, but it has middle-class jobs. So they're going after us because at the end of the day, organized labor is the only infrastructure, sorry for using that word, that actually creates power at the bargaining table and at the ballot box. So if we're gone, then what happens is it doesn't actually matter whether they have Citizens United or not. There's not another long-term infrastructure that creates that kind of ongoing power. And that's why the Friedrichs case, that's why Walker, that's why others go after us. And our argument with the Democratic Party is you got to understand that and actually have to have our back at this point in time.
I'm going to take some of the questions from the audience, although I've got 25 of my own at this point.
But you can have those questions with us over drinks.
We don't get to know which ones are really theirs or yours.
Yeah, I know.
All right, Randy just said that we could do this over drinks, so she's buying. Okay. How can we as a nation grow
It's a deal.
when we lack the basic fundamental human right of health care for all our citizens, in spite of the fact that we are the greatest spender of health care expenditures? It's a question that comes from the New York State Nurses Association.
Where's health care going to fit in this campaign? I mean, is this going to be where the political structure says, we did it, we have our national health care? Or is this going to be a central part of this discussion?
Well, I know some of us are actually fighting the misnomer of the Cadillac tax. Because what's happened is, look, I believe in single-payer health care, and that what we should have actually done is just extend Medicare.
That's right.
It would have been a lot easier, a lot better, whatever. Having said that, what's also happening right now is that under Obamacare, a lot of uninsured have gotten health care. But we're starting to have an underinsured problem, and at the bargaining table, which is where we have our power, what we're seeing is employer after employer, public and private sector, is basically using the excise tax and saying that, and using it as a sword of Damocles against all of us. And so, frankly, one of the things that we have been fighting for is we need that excise tax to be gone, because there's not that excise tax is actually hurting those of us who have spent blood, sweat, and tears to create good health care for members. It's actually really hurting them.
You know, I would also add, wherever you are on the Affordable Care Act, there is evidence that, particularly in southern states, that it's actually working, that people are getting insured. But what's amazing is that when you look at the demographics, there are all these folks that then say how much they hate the Affordable Care Act. And the Republicans have been beating that drum consistently. And I argued publicly and in writing, actually, in 2014, when the Democrats took all of these losses, that it was a mistake for us to shy away from that. There were incredible success stories with the Affordable Care Act, but the party did not acknowledge that at all, and we sort of ran away from that. And I think, going to everybody's point earlier, there are great things that Democrats are doing, but I think in many ways we've been shy and not actually pushed forward. And in the face of tremendous criticism, I think we needed to be stronger. I think we needed to have more of a backbone. And maybe 2014 wouldn't have happened the way that it did from a party perspective.
Can I just say, I think repealing the Cadillac tax, so-called, I mean, I hate that word, actually, but I just said it.
Mm-hmm. Excise.
Yeah, the excise
I'm trying to
tax
put it in my mind.
Is a starting point for Democrats, and I think we need to demand that all the candidates make it clear that they want to repeal that tax. You don't fix health care off the backs of working-class people. Exactly. This is the way you split people up, not the way you unite people. But also, as Randy said, I think while we don't have a Congress that will consider it, we need to stand up for Medicare for all. I am proud that that's part of our campaign, and I think that's part of building the mass movement and the political revolution.
But just a 30-second piece to that. What's interesting to me is when you listen to the Republican debates, one thing and I've talked about this for a while, one thing that's interesting is the governor of Ohio, John Kasich, actually expanded Medicaid under Obamacare in his state. He said he hated the bill, but he understood the impact that it would have on poor people in his state. I'm curious to see how long he keeps talking about that. Because it was he sort of bucked his own, he has his other problems, no question about it, but he sort of bucked his party to do that, and he wears it almost in some respects as a badge of honor, but my sense is that by the time the primary is over, you won't hear a word about that, and they'll all continue to demonize the bill. But it's something that, as I said before, the Democrats have had successes, but we've shied away from talking about them.
We're getting several questions that lead in the same direction. One from John Hyland at the PSC, and then Dan Labatz, who's actually teaching a course here on Latin America. But basically, in the near future, I see the Democratic Party as captured and controlled by capitalist corporations, and unions and workers need to move toward an independent labor party. How? Secondly, and Dan's question also challenges a little bit in terms of the Bernie Sanders movement. If and when Bernie Sanders loses the Democratic primary, is it possible that his followers might be drawn out of the Democratic Party to create a third force, perhaps first into the campaign of Jill Stein of the Green Party? Is this a possible way for a working class party to go? Juan, I'm going to ask you, you get big picture views, you talk to all these folks. What do the Greens got to say out there and others?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that the Green Party has maintained. It's been a resilient party. It's been able to continue to function, especially at local levels in some states, but it has never, unfortunately, caught on in a way that the Greens have in Europe. And I think part of that is because they've tended to go with candidates who really had an interest just as candidates running, not in terms of really building a party long term. So there's a similar party, which will remain unnamed in this state, that has the same approach. And I think that that the reality is, one of the things I've learned after all these years is that capitalism is an amazingly resilient system. It's always changing and adapting to its threats. And it begins so that movements rise, They seem to have major influence and an impact, and then all of a sudden the divisions start within the movements. The more enlightened capitalists figure out strategies to co-opt some and give enough concessions to diffuse the movement, and the movement then declines. So the problem is there's a reason why third parties have not developed in this country, because the system has been able to figure out ways to continually deviate the folks from those third parties. So I think that while it would be wonderful to have more alternatives, and I think part of what you're seeing in both the Republican and the Democratic parties right now is this battle that people want alternatives. I think, unfortunately, the way the system is structured right now, everything is geared against third and fourth parties, and everything is geared for the two dominant parties. So you've got to, on the one hand, maintain your ideals while at the same time work within the reality that you have.
Thank you. This is a question. We have a question that's directed towards Randy, but it's really goes to a broader question. I'll read the question, and then I'll try to broaden it out so everybody can respond. It says, for Randy, what was the benefit of an early endorsement versus simply waiting to see how the primary shakes out? But it also goes to this other question. We're getting a few. How important is labor unity in this process, and at what point do we try to hang together? And I was at the Central Labor Council for years. It was exasperating. Some unions endorse 2 years before an election.
Certain governor.
Based on polling. Others wait until it's so late that they reduce their impact. So I know it's difficult. But what was the thinking behind the early endorsement, and how sharp is the discussion in the labor movement about early endorsements at this point?
Well, first off, the AFL, Larry and I were both on the AFL when a year ago Trumka started talking about an endorsement process, meaning in July 2014, the AFL passed its endorsement process, which was even before the November, was it July 2014?
Yeah.
It was July or August. So it was just, I actually think about this as timely, not as early. If you look at the wall-to-wall coverage about elections right now, there's nothing else that is penetrating other than the coverage about elections. And I think that that's wrong, and I wish that we actually had a system like in Israel or in Great Britain where we'd have 3-month election period. And it would actually shorten the amount, it would actually hugely decrease the amount of money that was involved. I also think we should have a system where there's real limitations in terms of the amount of advertising that can be done, the system that has campaign finance and things like that. But what we've learned, frankly, from Pennsylvania and other places, is that we do not, if you want to actually influence in a real way by people power as opposed to money, you get in, you have an outside strategy, and you have an inside strategy. And you get in and you fight the fights inside as well as outside. And since the endorsement, and we can go through all of our process and things like that, we actually had more process and more conversations with our members in this endorsement than we've ever had in terms of the AFT. And so, yes, I know other unions can actually look at me and say, no, but I'm talking about our union in terms of our process. And I would actually ask every union here, you go through your own process, respect your own process. You'll never hear me talk about anybody else's process, but respect our process as well. But at the end of the day, what has happened is that we've actually spent a lot of time with the Clinton campaign, and you see that reflected, I hope, in the college compact that she put out. You see that reflected in terms of the early childhood piece. You see that reflected in every single day we are fighting for workers' rights and for working families within that campaign. At the end of the day, whoever the Democratic candidate is, given who is on the Republican side, our union will be out there. But what we saw from the beginning is that between what she understood, knows about public education, about higher education, about early childhood, about wanting to fight for workers. It's a different model than Bernie's model, but we felt that she was with us on the issues and that she had a plan for how to win.
Larry, please.
Yeah. And I agree with virtually all of what Randy just said. I think, first of all, we shouldn't expect labor unity in this country on issues like this. Where we should expect labor unity is to keep Diet High School open in Chicago. Where we should expect labor unity is when Verizon workers are fighting for a contract and workers get fired, that we stand up regardless of what union we're in. You're not going to get labor unity politically. We shouldn't expect it. What we should expect, as we just heard, is tolerance. And we should expect experimentation, that we don't continue to necessarily all do what we've done before, and that we can step out there and decide, regardless of what we do, how do we build independent political movement in this country? And in this city, you have a great example that most of us agree on, which is the Working Families Party. And, mentioned Bob Master before, but whether it's Bob or Arthur or any of the others in the room, I don't know everybody from every union, I think it's a real attempt here to build something that on the one hand is independent, but it still has full relevance to it. But I would go further and say that, I think we have to support new ways of doing this, independent political action. Even as a DNC member, you can't always do it through the Democratic Party, and we should support grassroots efforts for real change.
Absolutely.
Ed, I just wanted to raise something about this. Yesterday, Bill de Blasio came into the editorial board of the Daily News to sort of discuss matters, because obviously he's been under severe attack by certain media outlets in this city, and so I think he decided to come into the lion's den, so the Daily News has been beating him up on many issues, but on one of the issues is that he hasn't endorsed Hillary Clinton for president, his former boss. So the editors asked him again, well, Bill, are you still not endorsing Hillary Clinton? Why are you still not endorsing her? Hasn't she made all these changes? And I was really amazed to see how clear his analysis was on this. But he said, yes, she's definitely addressed a whole bunch of issues of income inequality. I think she's a terrific candidate, and she's really spoken to some of the issues that I'm concerned about. But I still have a couple of concerns. And he says, I want to hear clearly her position on $15 an hour minimum wage nationwide. And I want to hear more clearly her position on trade policy, which obviously meant the TPP. So he's basically still in the process of negotiating his endorsement. And it's refreshing to see a politician actually say, I want to see what your stands are on these issues. As much as I care about you, as much as I appreciate you and know how intelligent you are, these are the things in which I believe, and I want to see what your stands are on them. That you don't see that very often in the political world, or even in some of our labor unions. So I think that helps, and the effort that Randy and the AFT has done within the Clinton campaign has definitely, and of course the rise of Bernie Sanders has definitely pressed Hillary Clinton's campaign to move more and more in a progressive direction. That's positive. It's a question of what will be fulfilled actually if she does get elected, but so that the inside-outside does have an impact in how some of these politicians develop their programs and their.
Well, you've opened up the floodgates. We actually have several questions that move around. Question of trade. I'll read a couple. Why does Hillary Clinton support free trade? She's not taking a position on TPP. She is, I can't read all. She is also not taking a position on the school charter movement. And Bernie Sanders opposes free trade agreements, has spoken out against the attacks on public education, and opposes the TPP. Hillary Clinton has often supported neoliberal policies and counts many of her corporations as her supporters. What has she done to be worthy of a union endorsement? Some of this goes back. We get a lot of this around here, that there's an element of this election that feels very much like it's rooted in a Bush-Clinton discussion of the 90s around these questions of trade and where we go. And just in terms of the discussion within the labor movement and the Democratic Party, how much is that informing the debate at this point, and how sharp is it? Larry, I'm going to ask you to start.
Yeah, so, for me personally and for our union, the fight against Fast Track was huge. AFT was right there with us. This was a key reason why I did support Bernie, said I would volunteer. I think that those policies are not just failed, they're really a disgrace. I don't have enough time to get into it, but whether we go to Honduras or anywhere in Mexico, we see what the real tragedy has been in terms of these trade policies that did start with President Clinton, or even before President Clinton. Enough is enough of these trade policies. We need to put human rights, environmental rights, workers' rights in the front of this, not investor rights. We have investor rights in the front. Investor-state dispute settlement. And, we need every Democrat back to the party to say that sucks, that there's no place for investor-state dispute settlement, that you can't put corporations ahead of governments, whether it's in Ecuador, where Occidental Petroleum just won a $3 billion case under that against Ecuador because they said no more coastal drilling. That is the State Department doing that with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce year after year from one president to another. And we need to loudly say, no more to those kind of trade deals. And that's the kind of Democratic Party that I want. That's the kind of presidential campaign I want. And this is a core issue that, again, we are united on. It's just a question of how do you drive that to the front of these campaigns. And, my great-grandmother used to say, "I'll watch your feet, not your mouth." And that's the problem with the presidential campaign. What people say, where have they been? What has their path been? What have they done before? And that's what I think this is all about.
Yeah. I'll actually touch on, you're right, absolutely agree. I would also just touch a little bit on on some of the conversation around charters in education in a very specific way. We went through a period of time where you had what researchers call these new mayors, with mayors that had this sort of developmental approach to governing. We know many of them, and they've been all over the country. And they had this developmental approach to governing, lowering the tax base back and so on. But I think and I think charters were a part of that. What we're seeing, though, is through collective action, through organized labor, through the AFT, you've got, I think, labor saying, and others, activists, saying, you know what, we need to start rolling some of this back. Rahm Emanuel had a big scare in Chicago. Mm-hmm. Ras Baraka is now in Newark. Mm-hmm. You've got, and it's interesting to see what's happening in New Orleans, for example. I think in New Orleans, 9 out of 10 students goes to a charter school? So there was sort of a clear union-busting element there.
Total.
And so...
And 7,500 people, mostly African-American
Right.
teachers, getting fired
Right.
as part of Katrina.
That's right.
Let's not forget that.
That's right.
We saw 3 workers here. Can you imagine 7,500 workers after they've lost everything?
That's right.
Then get fired.
That's right.
Mostly African Americans.
That's exactly right. And you're starting to see now the relatively new superintendent starting to sort of take it back. It's going to take time, but I think the challenge, though, is that as Democrats, are we going to move away from this developmental approach to governing and get back to collective action and being responsive to communities and to labor? That I think you're starting to see a shift back, but I don't know how long it's going to take.
So since the question was directed to me,
That's right, it was.
Look, I would love for Hillary Clinton to be out there saying, no to TPP and no to Fast Track. And I think that, as Larry said, that is, for us, that was the right position. What people don't know is that AFSCME and AFT actually were the biggest funders for the AFL campaign on Fast Track. But we didn't take the front. People like Larry, people like the industrial trades, they were our workers who have gotten shafted. That's the front lines. What we're learning is sometimes you actually decide to fund things and help, but stay in the back of the line so that the people who are affected are out there. Because it is not what you say, it's what the American people hear. And we want that connection to be done. And so we do that in place after place after place in many ways because the object here is to actually change policy. The object here is not to be right, but to be enduring and transformational. And that's what some of us have actually done now. So you'll see the AFT out in front on education policies, on work and family policies that affect our members and the communities that we serve. But you'll see Larry and others in front on some of the other issues, even when we fund it. Just like the old labor movement used to always fund Martin Luther King and the civil rights movements and things like that. So that's what we do. So the bottom line for me is we need a different economic situation. Because regardless of what the trade policies are, we need manufacturing jobs in America. Good union jobs paying a middle-class wage. We need to make sure that Verizon is actually unionized, not just Verizon that has whatever the old phones we used to have in our homes, if we had one, but wireless. We need to focus on the sharing economy and freelancers and people who don't have economic rights now or who don't have unions. So at the end of the day, what we have actually fought for is what is your policy about the entire economy? Not just about trade that is moved offshore, but what are we going to do about making sure that offshore gets taxed? What are we going to do about making sure we have manufacturing again? What are we going to do about the effects of deindustrialization? And on charters, what are we going to do to make sure that there is a level playing field? That charters can't cream, that charters can't play by a separate set of rules, that there's actually a choice of a great neighborhood high school for parents, so that parents have that choice, so that poor parents and middle-class parents have that choice, so that middle-class parents and poor parents or parents who are poor middle-class actually have art and music in their schools, not just testing, so that workers don't get scapegoated anymore like teachers do. So we've actually had all those conversations with her, and actually her policies, you don't hear much because all you hear is email. But what you see is that she's been very clear about stop scapegoating workers. We need a labor movement. There needs to be a viable labor movement that can do the checks and balances in different industries and have a growing industrial base in this country so we have, once again, a growing middle class.
Thank you. On October 23rd here, we're going to have a forum on Black Lives Matter with George Gresham, among others, will be here. And we're getting a couple of questions on something that Black Lives Matter has called attention to. One is this whole issue of policing and where that fits in. We talk about inequality in this country, and one of the manifestations of inequality certainly is how communities of color get treated by the authorities and police enforcement. And the other question that we have, which fits into this, is should the Democratic Party and the unions begin to incorporate prison reform in the campaign in a more vigorous way? Many previously incarcerated persons cannot even vote. And I know that it's odd that the Koch brothers are also like, I guess we've sent one or two very rich guys to jail, and all of a sudden prison reform is on their agenda. Maybe there's a lesson in that. But I'll ask Juan to start off on answering that. And then after this question, I'm going to ask you to just do some closing remarks.
Well, I think on the Black Lives Matter movement, you really are seeing through some of the confrontations that have developed with some of the candidates, with Martin O'Malley and with Bernie Sanders and with Hillary Clinton. And I have to say, of those, the one who came off the best was Hillary. In terms, she actually had a conversation and a back and forth. I don't know how many of you saw the video when she was confronted by leaders of the Black Lives Matter, but it was actually one of the most telling moments of the entire Democratic primary at this point, with the back and forth between her and some of the young people over how she's trying to grapple with the issues of mass incarceration and police abuse. But I think that the reality is that movement is going to have to force, and a lot of us are going to have to force the candidates to deal with that issue because no political candidate wants to deal with the issue of police abuse because it will create so much friction within the different sectors that they're trying to appeal to. So they'd rather avoid it if possible. But the reality is that that's been a historic problem in the United States. I mean, virtually every racial riot or rebellion that I can remember, going back to the Chicago race riot of 1919, and the East St. Louis riot of 1917, all started over police abuse of African American citizens at some point. And went through Detroit and Watts and you name it, the Harlem riot of 1964, so this has been a historic problem within. And I believe what happens is every 20 years, all across America, you have a new police force because the police retire at 20 years. They go out, they get another job, and so you have a whole new crew of police that come into their jobs in every city across America. And so every 20 years, you have a whole new crew that has never really been confronted over how they abuse their power. And so you have to fight this fight over and over again because the culture of the police institutions in our society don't learn. And they repeat the same mistakes, and then the new crew of rookies come in and they have the same problem all over again until they go too far and the people then rebel against them, and then they learn that they have to respect folks again. So this is a recurring problem throughout American history, that how the police forces are used to repress and keep down racial minorities.
If you look at what opened up voting rights was the pictures on the Edmund Pettus Bridge about people getting disproportionately African-American church ladies and John Lewis getting bludgeoned. And those pictures went across America. In this instance, social media has actually been very helpful because what's happening is that there are pictures now, like of what has happened to Eric Garner, what happened to Michael Brown, what happened to the Sandra blank, but this is so. But this is a challenge for our unions to take on. And Barbara and others are part of our racial justice task force. We're going to have our recommendations in the next few weeks. They are going to include issues about mass incarceration and about excessive expulsions in schools. Mm-hmm. But the story I just want to end with is this: you have to have real conversations in a real respectful way within your unions. So I got arrested as part of a Jewish contingent saying Kaddish for Eric Garner on 96th and Broadway. And we didn't move. So the police had to arrest us in New York. So I was with, many people know my partner is a congregational rabbi. So I was with the rabbis and I decided I would do this. And I, did it in my individual capacity, but I also did it as the president of the AFT. We represent many correction officers and probation officers, and several of them were really pissed off at me for all these reasons. And instead of having an argument with them, we had a real conversation, and they are now part of our racial justice task force, because it needs to be a way of, we have to change law, but we have to change hearts and minds so that people, particularly with all due respect, white people, understand that we are treated differently by the police than black and brown babies and black and brown young people. And if we don't, as white allies, find a way to make sure that we say that as clearly as possible and that we become part of the agents for change, that's what Black Lives Matter has actually taught us and what our union is trying to do now.
I would say,
Please.
Yeah. So let me just understand, is this our closing?
No.
No.
Oh, we're on this, okay. Yeah, well, I mean, again, I would totally agree. I think that, we need to end prisons for profit, end them. No more privatization of prisons. Privatization is not working in charter schools. It's even worse in prisons. I was proud that Bernie and many others introduced legislation to end for-profit prisons. We need community review boards across the country about what police are doing. If teachers get held accountable, and so many others get held accountable for their results, police need to be held accountable for their results also. And whether they have a union or not, that's a reality. The community is supposed to be served here. And I think we need that level of accountability, and that people should be proud to have that kind of accountability in their communities. I think that we all embrace, whether we're white, black, or brown, immigrant or native born, Black Lives Matter as a wake-up call that this kind of institutional racism is across our country. It's north and south. I grew up in North Philadelphia. A guy named Frank Rizzo was the police commissioner. I saw him say, "Get their black asses," as a cop beat a girl next to me, and she died in front of me. And so, and he went on to be the mayor of that city, and his statue is in front of City Hall. I could tell you what I'd like to do with it. But, I mean, that is a part of our culture wherever we lived, and we have to be part of a movement that's going to bring that down, confront it, embrace it, and understand it.
I know you like to talk about books, so on this issue of police brutality, I recommend reading James Baldwin's Notes from an Occupied Territory. Right. Fantastic piece. Yeah. Just tying the Black Lives Matter, this part of the discussion, to something we touched on earlier, I wonder where it goes, because there's going to be increasing pressure on them to deal with the issue of guns in our community, and I'm thinking specifically about this young man that worked for Governor Cuomo that just passed away. Yeah. It's incredibly tragic. I mean, I was 12 years old, and I was shot by a 14-year-old that wanted me to sell drugs for him, and I kept refusing. Needless to say, I didn't get to go outside for a while after my mother didn't let me go out. But that said, this is an issue that we've been dealing with in our communities forever. And I wonder if there's going to be pressure, and how much pressure, on Black Lives, because you're hearing it already, to sort of transition and deal with also this issue of gun violence in communities of color by individuals within that community, and not just on behalf of the police department. But if you look at what they've done, look at the impact that they've had. We're talking about body cameras. We're talking about the demilitarization of police departments, which has already begun. We're also talking, look at what's happened in Ferguson specifically, an incredibly oppressive system that had poor people, poor black people, in this, with warrants because they didn't pay tickets, and putting them into the criminal justice system because they didn't pay a ticket. And then going to something that Randy said earlier, this sort of school-to-prison pipeline that exists. So I wonder where the sort of Black Lives Matter movement goes, but thinking about the fact that Black lives do matter, they matter in not very different, but they matter in a lot of different arenas. Yep. And they intersect so many other policies. So I would love to see them, over time, maybe branch, not just engage in the police brutality issues, but also work with organized labor and work with other institutions, even political institutions and government institutions, to actually start to force change. It's an incredibly young and vibrant movement, but it's also multi-generational, it's also multiracial, and that's what the beauty of it. They're changing minds, and they're changing philosophy, and they're changing policy. And I think they would be an incredible force, whether it's Democrat or Republican, but certainly you can be in the Democratic Party and force the Democrats to start making changes in how we do business as well.
Okay, for a closing, I'm going to frame this, but you should say whatever you really want to leave this audience with. But at the end of 2016, where do you want the labor movement and the Democratic Party to be positioned, both in terms of what we should have accomplished at that point, but also in terms of the relationship between the party and organized unions in particular? And I'm going to do this I'm going to ask Basil to go first, and Juan then Randy, and then Larry?
Well, at the end of 2016, of course, I hope there's a Democrat in the White House. I know there will be. We've got tremendous candidates. If you watch the Republicans, if y'all watch the debates, it would be funny if it wasn't so tragic. And, they're talking about defunding Planned Parenthood and willing to shut the government down to do that. I mean, it is incredibly scary stuff. And I tell you, it is, and just coming from the perspective of a state party, we have an incredible opportunity next year to not only put a Democrat in the White House, but we have this incredible opportunity to also change state houses and change state legislatures. There's a candidate in the 52nd Senate District in upstate New York, covering about 4 counties, Tioga, Broome County, Chemung, and a Democrat has not won that seat in over 100 years. But we actually have an opportunity this year to elect her. Barbara Fiala is her name, by the way, if you go look her up. But we can actually even take the Senate back next year, given the activity in New York. But this is not isolated. We can be doing this across the country. So what I would like to see is the state parties, because as I said at the beginning, we're a little bruised and battered, but we're there. And we are going to be focused on a lot of these down ballot races, to work with organized labor, to work with activists, to get out these votes, because we've also had some turnout issues as well. Even in New York City, actually upstate's been voting a lot better than New York City has. And so, I want to partner with anyone that I can to make sure that we actually can take back not just the state house, not the state Senate here, but across the country, because the state, and I go back to this, state elections are so incredibly important. That's where I'd like to be.
Well, I'm not as optimistic about what the results will be come November and where things will be in terms of progressive movements in the country. I do think that the next year is going to be a very bitterly fought battle here that's going to erupt. I mean, that article that the New York Times had several months ago about how all of the money for the Republican candidates is coming from a few hundred people is astounding, because given the amount of money, and the reason there are so many candidates among the Republicans is there's so many multimillionaires who are willing to put money into bankrolling them. As Randy said, the Citizens United has unleashed, we're going to see it really for the first time in this election, extraordinary amount of money, all geared to capturing control of the national government. So yes, there are very powerful social movements, but there's also an enormous amount of money that's going to be thrown at these campaigns, and the propaganda on television, especially in some of these battleground states, will be nonstop. You will not be able to turn the TV off, or the banner ads on your internet searches and all that stuff will be flooded with this stuff. So that, however, I think that it really is an issue of whether the Democratic candidates arouse the population. Barack Obama was able to arouse the population and bring in a whole bunch of new voters, even though I was always a little dubious about Obama. I always didn't sense he was quite as liberal as he appeared to be at the time. But I think that he was able to arouse whole new sectors of the population to participate in voting, and that made the difference. So I think that's going to be the issue. To what degree do the candidates inspire participation by the Democratic and independent voters to be able to say, we got to go out for this person?
What do we want to see in terms of January 17? I want to see what just happened in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is a school board got changed because of community and educator involvement. And the first thing the school board did was to stop the closing of this little elementary school called Wolves Air, which was a neighborhood school, and they created a project-based STEAM magnet, and they had about 100 more kids come this year than last year, and the community is celebrating the fact that there is now a viable community school in that area in Pittsburgh. And that at the second, and that with the work that we're doing in terms of career tech ed, that the mayor of Pittsburgh and the community board and the Board of Education has now put a public safety magnet in Westinghouse High School so that we can diversify the police and the fire force in Pittsburgh. So elections matter on real issues that really matter to real people. And so the issue becomes, how do we actually change our democracy? How do we change our economic blueprint so that that kind of story happens over and over and over again for working people in America? That is what my aim is and what we're trying to do. That's why the down ballot races mean a lot. That's why we have to change the trajectory of what happened in 2014, where people were with us on ballot initiatives all throughout the country. When it was that, they voted with us. But yet, because of the demonization, because of the denigration, because people didn't connect with the candidates, the hatred that was spawned on TV actually moved people to either not voting or to voting for Republicans in very close races, who then, like a Rauner, like a Walker, then do everything in their power to kill our rights so that we do not have the kind of power going forward. So this is bigger, frankly, to me, than who is in the White House. This is a matter of who's in the Congress, who's in the state houses, who's in the city government, who's at the Board of Education, so that we can actually make things better in America for those who want and work so hard for the American dream.
Yeah.
Larry.
So I think that's the right question. In 2016, a little more than 2 years from now, a little more than a year from now, where will we be? And the effort that we all put in, what will it accomplish? And I would come down saying that we need to be feeling and acting as if we are building this political revolution, that it is not working. Business as usual is not working. That whether you had the experience, Juan had with the president or my own, because I was definitely in the optimistic camp and working for that every minute, I think we have to come to an end of that kind of politics, that we have to be willing to throw in with much more transformational politics, this political revolution that says no more super PACs. Right now, no more super PACs. We're fed up with super PACs. We don't need super PACs. No more super PACs. That we need to get the big money out of politics once and for all, not go for our share of that big money. And that the American people, whether they're independent or Republican or Democrat, that we continue to beat that drum so people understand this doesn't work for any of us. And yeah, candidates in the moment, go for it, but we need to reject it. And that we need to build on our own issues. We need to insist that candidates run on what's right, what we believe in. If we don't believe in it ourselves, why will anyone else believe in it? And so we need candidates who will run on these things of good and free education from one end to the other, not more charter schools. And AFT has clearly been in the forefront of that. And we need candidates who are going to run on a new trade paradigm and reject it once and for all. The State Department has been wrong. It hasn't worked. The Chamber of Commerce has been wrong. It hasn't worked. We reject Fast Track. We reject TPP. And we need candidates, and we need to feel in a year, a little more than a year, that we've built up a belief that it's intolerable for workers to get fired, whether it's one by one with humiliation, as these three sisters and brothers faced, or whether it's an entire school district, or whether it's an entire factory closed and people don't know where they go next. We need to say enough is enough, and that we're building a political revolution, and that we're each a part of it that speaks to that, not just to one election. And, I'm confident that regardless of where we stand right now, that we can all throw in to that kind of movement. And that we can all believe that it's not working as it is now for working class people. And that we can build on the 4 movements that Juan talked about and more. And that we can reach down and say to ourselves, we have to rise up. We need a new populism in this country. That's sweeping around the world as a reaction to this kind of capitalism. And that we can all be a part of that. And that is the American dream in the 21st century. And I'm proud to be working in my own way for that. And I hope we'll all join together to do it.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody for coming this morning and remind you again that on October 23rd we'll have a forum on Black Lives Matter. The other thing I learned today is that Larry gives me hope for retirement. You can find wonderful things to do. There's also, I've been asked to make an announcement. There's a 10:30 meeting with Larry at the Mechanics Hall, 20 West 44th Street, which is, if you go out the door here and make a right, it's right next door on the 44th Street side on the 2nd floor. And I assume that's a meeting of Bernie, Labor for Bernie?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for announcing
Okay.
it. Thanks. You're terrific.
Oh, yes, I forgot. We have all these folks who didn't get tickets and in but are watching on live stream. Give us some feedback in terms of how that worked for you, and let's try it again. But we're learning new media ourselves, Randy. Thanks again, folks.
Thanks, everybody.